In the sprawling corridors of the Celestial Peace Station, where 100 alien species conduct their daily business under the watchful eye of the Galactic Council, most beings have learned to look the other way when the powerful abuse the weak. After all, survival often depends on not making waves in a universe where your next breath might depend on someone else's mercy. But humans are different. They don't look away. They don't calculate the odds. When they see injustice, something ancient and primal awakens in their DNA. Something that once drove their ancestors to fight saber-toothed tigers with nothing but sharpened sticks, something that made them climb down from the trees and decide they owned the entire planet. Staff Sergeant Marcus Dragonshun of the Human Defense Corps is about to remind everyone in the galaxy why his species earned their reputation as the most dangerously unpredictable warriors the universe has ever seen. And it all starts with a simple act of kindness toward a frightened alien girl who just wanted to do her job without being tormented. Some lines should never be crossed. Some people should never be pushed too far. Today, the galaxy is about to learn that lesson the hard way. The following account has been compiled from security footage, witness testimonies, and official reports from the Celestial Peace Station incident that changed interstellar relations forever. The morning shift on Celestial Peace Station began like any other, with the soft hum of artificial gravity generators and the distant thrum of massive engines keeping the 20-kilometer-long structure in perfect orbit around the neutral moon of Kepler 442c. In the diplomatic quarters of Section 7, where the galaxy's most influential species maintain their embassies, the polished floors gleamed under bioluminescent lighting that had been carefully calibrated to accommodate the visual spectrums of 47 different alien species. Zerith moved quietly through the corridors, her six-limbed form perfectly suited for the maintenance tasks that kept the diplomatic wing functioning smoothly. As a member of the Veltar species, her natural flexibility and attention to detail made her people highly sought after as custodial staff throughout the galaxy. Her pale blue skin, marked with the intricate silver patterns that denoted her family lineage, caught the light as she carefully polished each surface to perfection. She had been working on Celestial Peace Station for 3 standard years now, ever since her homeworld's economic collapse had forced millions of Veltar into the service industry across known space. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a young scholar, but it was honest work that allowed her to send credits back to her family while they struggled to rebuild their war-torn world. The Veltar had once been a proud civilization of philosophers and artists, their crystal cities rising like frozen music from the purple sands of their homeworld. But that was before the Hegemony War, before the orbital bombardments that had shattered their cities and scattered their people across the galaxy like seeds on a cosmic wind. Now, most Veltar worked as servants, their natural grace and intelligence making them valuable to species who saw them as little more than sophisticated cleaning equipment. Zerith tried not to dwell on such thoughts as she worked. The morning routine was soothing in its predictability. Check the atmospheric controls in each embassy suite. Replace the biofilters that kept the air breathable for different species. Polish the surfaces until they gleamed. Water the exotic plants that various ambassadors kept to remind them of home. Simple tasks, but each one performed with the meticulous care that was encoded in her people's DNA. She was humming softly to herself, a traditional Veltar melody that spoke of crystal winds and silver moons, when she heard the voices approaching from around the corner. Instinctively, she ducked her head and focused on her work. Experience had taught her that it was always better to remain invisible when the important people were conducting their business. "I still say we're wasting time with these negotiations," came a deep, rumbling voice that she recognized immediately. Lord Commander Vexith of the Crothry Empire, one of the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy. The Crothry were a warrior species, standing nearly 3 meters tall with thick, armored hide and massive claws that could slice through steel. They controlled 17 star systems and had never lost a war in their recorded history. "The humans have proven to be surprisingly adaptable," replied another voice, this one belonging to Trade Minister Kalrith of the Merchant Guild. The Call were a species of calculating entrepreneurs whose tentacled forms had evolved for manipulating complex financial instruments rather than weapons. They controlled the flow of resources through half the galaxy and could bankrupt entire civilizations with a single trade embargo. Adaptable. Lord Commander Vexitha's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. They've been in space for barely 200 years. My species was building star cruisers when theirs were still throwing rocks at each other. The only reason they have any influence at all is because they breed like tribble rats and fight like cornered death cats. Zero-TH continued polishing the same section of wall, keeping her movements small and quiet. These were dangerous beings to overhear, and she had no desire to attract their attention. But their conversation made her curious despite herself. She had heard stories about the humans, of course. Everyone had. They were the newcomers, the species that had seemed to appear out of nowhere and somehow carved out a place for themselves among the great powers of the galaxy. Still, Minister Kalrith said thoughtfully, their military record is concerning. The Battle of the Helix Nebula, the Siege of Fortress Carol, the incident at the Vorthen Gate. They seem to have a talent for winning battles they shouldn't be able to win. Lucky shots and desperate tactics Vexith dismissed. Any species fights harder when they're cornered. But they lack discipline, strategy, honor. They're barbarians who stumbled on a hyperdrive technology. The two powerful aliens continued their conversation as they walked past, their voices fading as they moved deeper into the diplomatic wing. Zero-TH remained frozen in place for several more minutes, making sure they were truly gone before she allowed herself to relax. She had learned the hard way that powerful beings sometimes doubled back to test whether their conversations had been overheard. As she resumed her work, she found herself thinking about the humans. She had never actually seen one in person, though she had heard descriptions. They were said to be of medium height compared to most galactic species, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, no natural armor, and relatively weak physical capabilities. By all accounts, they should have been conquest fodder for any of the major powers. Yet somehow, they had not only survived, but thrived in a galaxy that seemed designed to destroy them. The morning progressed peacefully after that encounter. Zero-TH completed her rounds of the diplomatic quarters and moved on to the commercial district, where traders and merchants from across the galaxy conducted their business. The sights and sound were overwhelming even after 3 years. Beings of every conceivable shape and size speaking in dozens of languages, the air filled with the mixed aromas of exotic spices, alien foods, and industrial chemicals. She was cleaning the windows of a Terrellian spice merchant shop when she first saw them. 3 figures in the distinctive black and gold uniforms of the Hegemony security forces, moving through the crowd with the casual arrogance of predators who knew that everyone else was prey. The HSF was technically supposed to maintain order on the station, but everyone knew they were really just enforcers for the most powerful species in the galaxy. Leading the group was Captain Vorthak, a Hegemony officer whose reputation for cruelty was legendary even by their standards. The Hegemony species stood nearly 4 meters tall, with metallic exoskeletons that made them look like walking war machines. Their faces were hidden behind elaborate masks that both protected them from alien atmospheres and added to their intimidating appearance. Vorthak's mask was decorated with the skull of some unknown predator, and his uniform bore the decorations of someone who had personally conquered 3 different worlds. Walking beside him was Lieutenant Zephran, another Hegemony officer whose specialty was said to be interrogation. The third figure was Enforcer Grixtal, a member of the Korthak species that serve as mercenaries and hired muscle throughout the galaxy. Standing 2.5 meters tall with 4 arms and naturally poisonous claws, Grixtal looked like evolution had specifically designed him for violence. Zero-TH immediately ducked her head and tried to make herself invisible, but it was too late. Captain Vorthak's attention had already fixed on her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against her skin. Well, Vorthak said, his voice artificially amplified by his mass vocal processors. What do we have here? A little Veltar worker bee, buzzing around where she doesn't belong. The words were spoken loudly enough that conversations began dying around them as other beings in the commercial district sensed potential trouble. Most aliens had learned to give hegemony officers a wide berth, but there was something about the situation that seemed to draw their attention despite their better judgment. I was just cleaning the windows, Honored One, Zirath said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. I mean, no disturbance. Cleaning. Vorthak stepped closer, and she could smell the metallic scent of his exoskeleton. I think you were eavesdropping, listening to conversations that don't concern you. Isn't that right, little spy? No, Honored One. I would never. Silence. The word cracked through the air like a whip. I didn't give you permission to speak again. Zirath felt her stomach clench with fear. She had heard stories about what happened to beings who attracted the wrong kind of attention from hegemony officers. Some disappeared entirely. Others were found days later as examples to anyone else who might consider stepping out of line. On your knees, Vorthak commanded. I think we need to discuss proper respect for your betters. The commercial district had gone completely silent now. Dozens of aliens watched from what they hoped was a safe distance, but none moved to interfere. In a galaxy where survival often depended on not attracting attention, intervening in someone else's problem was seen as a form of suicide. Zirath slowly lowered herself to her knees, her cleaning supplies scattering across the polished floor. She could feel hot tears beginning to form in her large, dark eyes, but she fought to hold them back. Crying would only make things worse. That's better, Vorthak said with satisfaction. Now, I want you to apologize for being where you don't belong, loudly enough that everyone can hear you. I apologize for being where I don't belong, Zirath whispered. Louder. I apologize for being where I don't belong. Louder. And tell everyone what you are. Zirath's voice broke as she forced herself to speak. I apologize for being where I don't belong. I am nothing. I'm just a cleaner. That's right, Vorthak said, his voice filled with cruel satisfaction. You are nothing. Your people are nothing. The only reason you're allowed to exist is because you're useful for scrubbing floors and emptying waste recyclers. Lieutenant Zephyran stepped forward with what might have been a smile visible behind his mask. Maybe we should give her some real cleaning to do. I heard there was an incident in the waste processing center earlier. Some very unpleasant cleanup required. Excellent idea, Vorthak agreed. What do you say, little nothing? Ready to crawl through some toxic waste to show everyone how grateful you are for the privilege of serving your betters? It was at that moment, as Zirath knelt in the middle of the silent commercial district with three of the galaxy's most dangerous enforcers standing over her like executioners, that she heard a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. That's enough. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but somehow they carried with perfect clarity to every corner of the commercial district. Vorthak spun around, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma weapon at his side, looking for the source of the interruption. Standing about 10 meters away, leaning casually against the wall of a shop that sold Andromedan crystals, was a being that Zirath had never seen before, but immediately recognized from the description she had heard. Human. Male, by the look of him, though she wasn't entirely certain how to tell with their species. He stood perhaps 1 meter and 8/10 tall, with dark hair and olive-colored skin that marked him as coming from one of the warmer regions of the human homeworld. He wore the distinctive uniform of the Human Defense Corps, though the insignia on his sleeve indicated a rank that Zirath couldn't identify. The uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, matte black with subtle armor plating and equipment harnesses that spoke of someone who expected to face real combat rather than parade around for political purposes. What struck her most, however, was his complete lack of fear. Every other being in the commercial district had either fled or was trying to make themselves invisible, but this human stood perfectly relaxed, as if confronting 3 heavily armed hegemony officers was something he did every day before breakfast. I'm sorry, Vorthax said, his voice dripping with dangerous calm. "Did you just tell me what to do, human?" "I told you it was enough," the human replied, his tone still conversational. The girl was doing her job. No laws broken, no harm caused, no justification for your little power trip. Enforcer Grixtal took a step forward, his forearms flexing as poison dripped from his claws. "Human, you have 10 seconds to walk away before I demonstrate why your species should learn to mind their own business." The human didn't move. In fact, he seemed to settle more comfortably against the wall, as if he was getting ready to watch an interesting show rather than preparing to fight for his life. "Here's the thing," he said, and for the first time Ziritage heard something cold creep into his voice. "I've been watching this little performance for the last 5 minutes, and I've come to a conclusion. You three aren't enforcing any laws. You're not maintaining order. You're not protecting anyone or serving any legitimate purpose. You're just bullying someone who can't fight back because it makes you feel important." "Human," Vorthax said, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine threat. "You are interfering with official hegemony security business. That is a capital offense under station regulations." "Official business?" The human straightened up from the wall, and something about the movement made Zirith's skin prickle with sudden tension. "Let me see your authorization forms. Your incident report. Your justification for detaining a civilian worker. We don't need authorization to question suspected criminals." "Suspected of what? Cleaning windows too effectively? Having the wrong color skin? Not bowing low enough when you walk by?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background hum of the station's life support systems seemed to fade as every being in the commercial district held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, Lieutenant Zephyran made what would later be recognized as a critical tactical error. He laughed. "You humans," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "Always sticking your noses where they don't belong. Always thinking you're heroes. But you're just another primitive species that got lucky with some stolen technology. You want to play hero? Fine. But when we're done with you, you'll wish you'd minded your own business." The human was quiet for a moment, his head tilted slightly as if he was considering the lieutenant's words. Then he smiled, and Zirith felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was not a pleasant smile. "You know what?" the human said. "I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to play hero today. But here's the thing about humans that you might not have learned yet." He pushed out from the wall and began walking toward them with the same casual confidence that he had shown from the beginning. "We don't play fair." Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun had been having a relatively peaceful morning until he witnessed 3 of the galaxy's most notorious bullies decide to terrorize a young Veltar woman for the crime of existing while vulnerable. As a member of the Human Defense Corps' Special Operations Division, Marcus had seen more than his share of cruelty and injustice throughout the galaxy, but something about the scene in the commercial district triggered every protective instinct that 2 million years of evolution had burned into human DNA. The insignia on his uniform identified him as a dragon soldier, one of the elite units that had earned their fearsome reputation in the worst battles of humanity's expansion into space. The name came from an ancient human legend about warriors who fought with such ferocity that their enemies believed they had transformed into mythical beasts. In the modern Human Defense Corps, dragon soldiers were the ones called in when regular military forces weren't enough, when the situation required someone willing to do whatever it took to complete the mission. Marcus had earned his place among the dragons during the Battle of the Helix Nebula, where a small human fleet had somehow managed to defeat a hegemony armada 3 times their size. The official reports credited superior tactics and innovative technology, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. When pushed to the breaking point, humans stopped calculating odds and started calculating how much damage they could do before they went down. Now, as he walked slowly toward 3 beings who could probably tear him apart with their bare hands, Marcus felt that familiar cold calm settling over his mind. It was the same mental state that had allowed him to survive impossible battles, the psychological space where fear and doubt simply ceased to exist because there wasn't time for such luxuries. Human, Captain Vorthak said, his voice carrying the electronic distortion of his mask's vocal processors. I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away. The hegemony has a long memory, and we don't forget those who interfere with our operations. Your operations? Marcus stopped walking when he was about 5 meters away from them, close enough to move quickly, but far enough to avoid their initial attacks. I hate to break it to you, but terrorizing cleaning ladies isn't actually in your official job description. Everything on the station falls under hegemony jurisdiction when it relates to security, Lieutenant Zefran said, stepping slightly to the left to give himself a better angle of attack. This worker was behaving suspiciously, potentially gathering intelligence for hostile forces. Marcus glanced at Ziritich, who was still kneeling on the floor with her cleaning supplies scattered around her like evidence of some terrible crime. She was clearly terrified, her large dark eyes wide with fear, but she was trying to hold herself together despite being the center of attention for every being in the commercial district. Right? Marcus said, turning his attention back to the 3 enforcers. She was gathering intelligence while polishing windows. That's definitely the kind of sophisticated espionage operation that requires 3 heavily armed officers to investigate. I'm sure the Hegemony Intelligence Division will be thrilled to hear that their security protocols now include interrogating janitors. Enforcer Grixtal, the 4-armed Korthax mercenary, had been moving slowly to the right while the conversation continued. Now he was positioned to attack from Marcus's flank, his poisonous claws extended and ready to strike. The movement was subtle enough that most beings wouldn't have noticed it, but dragon soldiers were trained to track multiple threats simultaneously. You want to know what I think? Marcus continued, his tones still conversational. I think you 3 were bored. I think you were walking through the district looking for someone to push around, and you picked her because she's small and alone, and her people don't have any political power. I think this isn't about security or intelligence or anything official. I think you're just bullies who got lucky enough to be born in a species that are bigger and stronger than most. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of tension that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Around the commercial district, other beings pressed themselves against walls or ducked behind stalls, sensing that violence was about to erupt. A few of the smarter aliens had already begun quietly evacuating the area entirely. Bullies! Vorthak's voice carried a note of genuine outrage. Human, my species conquered 17 star systems before yours even discovered fire. I have personally led the subjugation of 3 different worlds. I'm a Lord Commander of the Hegemony military, and you dare to call me a bully? If the armor fits, Marcus said with a slight shrug. Though I have to say, conquering planets is a lot easier when you're picking on people who can't fight back. That seems to be a pattern with your people. That was when Grixtal made his move. The Korthax enforcer was fast, incredibly fast, his 4 arms moving in a coordinated attack pattern designed to overwhelm his target with multiple simultaneous strikes. His poisonous claws could punch through most body armor, and his reach advantage meant that most opponents would be dead before they could even touch him. Marcus wasn't most opponents. As Grixtal lunged forward, Marcus dropped into a crouch and rolled to the left, coming up in a position that put the enforcer between him and the 2 hegemony officers. His hand moved to the weapon at his side, but instead of drawing the plasma pistol that everyone expected, he pulled out what looked like a simple metal rod about 30 centimeters long. What is that supposed to be? Zefran asked, his voice filled with contempt. A stick? You're going to fight us with a stick. Marcus activated the weapon, and the metal rod suddenly extended to nearly 2 meters in length while electricity crackled along its surface. It was a neural disruptor, a weapon that the Human Defense Corps had developed specifically for fighting enemies who were larger and stronger than baseline humans. Instead of trying to overpower their opponents, it delivered targeted electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt nerve function and motor control. Not just any stick, Marcus said, spinning the weapon in a complex pattern that made the air hum with electrical discharge. But you probably wouldn't understand the technology. After all, according to you, Humans are just primitive barbarians who got lucky. Grixtau recovered from his failed attack and circled to the right, looking for another opening. The Korthax were known for their patience in combat, willing to probe their enemies' defenses until they found a weakness. But as he moved, Marcus turned with him, keeping the neural disruptor between them while maintaining awareness of the two hegemony officers behind him. "You cannot defeat all three of us," Vorthax stated with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "Even if you somehow manage to scratch one of us with your primitive weapon, the other two will tear you apart." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But here's what you need to understand about humans. We didn't become a space-faring civilization because we were the biggest or the strongest or the most naturally gifted. We made it because we're too stubborn to know when to quit." He was watching their body language now, reading the micro-expressions and subtle shifts in posture that indicated when someone was about to attack. Grixtau was getting ready to make another move, his muscles tensing for a leap. Zephyran was reaching for his sidearm, a heavy plasma rifle that could probably punch a hole through a starship hull. Vorthak was activating some kind of enhancement system built into his armor, preparing to use his species' natural strength advantage. "Last chance, human," Vorthak said. "Walk away now, and we might only break a few bones. Stay, and we'll make sure your death serves as an example to any other heroes who think they can interfere with hegemony business." Marcus looked at Ziritich, who was still kneeling on the floor, but watching the confrontation with wide eyes. She had probably never seen anything like this before, had probably spent her whole life learning to stay invisible when the powerful decided to flex their muscles. But there was something in her expression now, a tiny spark of hope that someone might actually stand up for her. "You know what?" Marcus said, turning his attention back to the three enforcers. "I think I'll stay. After all, someone needs to teach you three the lesson your parents obviously forgot." "Which is?" Zephyran asked, his weapon now fully drawn and charged. Marcus smiled, and there was something in that expression that made even seasoned warriors like the hegemony officers feel a moment of unease. It was the smile of someone who had stared death in the face so many times that it had become an old friend, the smile of someone who had long ago stopped caring about the odds. "But there's always someone tougher than you," he said, "and today that someone is going to be very unhappy about what you did to that girl." The attack came from three directions simultaneously. Grixtau leaped forward with all four arms extended, his claws aimed at Marcus's chest and throat. Zephyran fired his plasma rifle, the energy bolt searing the air where Marcus had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Vorthak charged straight ahead, his armored fists moving like pile drivers toward Marcus's head. Marcus moved like water, flowing between their attacks with a fluid grace that came from years of training and countless battles. The neural disruptor traced patterns in the air that seemed random, but were actually precisely calculated, each movement designed to put him exactly where his enemies didn't expect him to be. The weapon's first contact was with Grixtau's left arm, a glancing blow that sent electrical pulses coursing through the Korthax's nervous system. The enforcer's coordination faltered for just a moment, causing him to crash into a merchant stall instead of landing gracefully on his feet. Marcus spun away from Vorthak's charge, using the hegemony officer's momentum against him. As the massive alien thundered past, Marcus struck with a neural disruptor, catching Vorthak behind the knee. The electrical discharge caused the officer's leg to buckle unexpectedly, sending him crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks from his damaged armor systems. Zephyran was already firing again, but Marcus had anticipated the shot. He dove behind a nearby stall, selling Turellian spices, the plasma bolt searing through the air where he had been and scorching a hole in the wall behind him. The smell of burned metal and exotic spices filled the air as Marcus rolled to his feet and looked for his next move. "Impossible," Zephyran snarled, adjusting his aim for another shot. "You're just a human. You can't possibly match three trained warriors." "You're right," Marcus called back from behind the spice stall. "I can't match you. But the thing about humans is we don't try to match our enemies. We try to outsmart them." As if on cue, there was a sudden electrical failure throughout the commercial district. The lights flickered and went out. Emergency illumination kicked in, and most of the electronic systems that controlled everything from atmospheric processors to security cameras went offline for several seconds before backup power restored basic functions. In the confusion of the blackout, Marcus moved. When the lights came back up, he was standing directly behind Zefran with a neural disruptor pressed against the base of the officer's skull, right where the spinal column connected to the brain. "Now," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the commercial district, "I think we need to discuss proper behavior when you're guests on someone else's station." The commercial district of Celestial P Station had seen many confrontations over the years, but nothing quite like the sight of a single human holding a neural disruptor to the head of a hegemony security officer, while two other elite warriors struggled to understand how their perfect ambush had been turned against them in less than 30 seconds. Lieutenant Zefran stood perfectly still, his plasma rifle useless at such close range. The neural disruptor pressing against his skull was designed to deliver precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses directly into the nervous system. One wrong move, one moment of overconfidence, and he would spend the rest of his life as a drooling vegetable, assuming he survived the neural cascade failure at all. "This is impossible," Grixtal growled from where he had crashed into the spice merchant's stall. The Korthax enforcer was trying to regain his footing, but the electrical discharge from Marcus's weapon had disrupted his motor control. Two of his four arms were twitching uncontrollably, and his natural coordination was completely compromised. Captain Vorthak had managed to push himself back to his feet, though his damaged armor sparked occasionally where the neural disruptor had found gaps in the plating. His masked face turned toward Marcus with what might have been respect if it hadn't been filled with so much rage. "Ow! Vorthak demanded. That electrical failure was not a coincidence. You planned this." Marcus kept the neural disruptor steady against Zefran's skull, while his eyes tracked the movements of the other two enforcers. "Dragon soldiers don't fight fair fights," he said conversationally. "We fight smart fights. That power surge you experienced? Let's just say that human technology has some interesting capabilities when it comes to electronic warfare." The truth was slightly more complex. Marcus's armor contained a sophisticated suite of electronic countermeasures that could interface with most standard station systems. When he had first entered the commercial district that morning, his suit's computer had automatically mapped the local power grid and identified several vulnerable nodes. A simple command transmitted on an encrypted frequency had caused a cascading overload in the district's electrical systems, creating exactly the kind of distraction he needed. "You're still outnumbered," Zefran said, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "Even if you kill me, the other two will tear you apart." "Will they?" Marcus asked. He shifted slightly, angling his body so that he could keep both remaining opponents in his peripheral vision. "Grixtal over there can barely stand up straight, and Vorthak's armor has enough electrical damage that his movement systems are compromised. But more importantly, they're starting to realize something that you haven't figured out yet." "Which is what?" Vorthak asked, though there was a note of wariness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "That this was never about a fair fight," Marcus replied. "This was about sending a message." As if on cue, the commercial district's main entrance opened to admit a group of beings that made even the hegemony officers pause in concern. 6 humans in the black and gold uniforms of the Defense Corps, each carrying the kind of heavy weapons typically reserved for assault operations. Their leader was a tall woman with lieutenant stripes on her sleeve and the cold eyes of someone who had seen far too much combat. "Dragon 7, this is Dragon 1, the woman said, speaking into her comm unit while her eyes never left the 3 enforcers. "We have visual confirmation of hostile forces threatening a civilian. Requesting permission to engage under Article 12 of the Station Defense Accords." "Dragon 1, Dragon 7, came a voice over the comm that everyone in the district could hear clearly. "Permission granted. Protect the civilian by any means necessary." Marcus felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the expressions change on the faces of his opponents. The Station Defense Accords were a complex treaty that governed military operations on neutral territory, but Article 12 was very specific. Any military unit could take action to protect civilians from unlawful violence, and that protection extended to using lethal force if necessary. Now then, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to particularly slow students. Let me clarify the situation for you. You three decided to abuse your authority to terrorize an innocent worker. That was your first mistake. You then threatened and attempted to assault a human military officer who was lawfully protecting that civilian. That was your second mistake, and it was much worse than the first. Lieutenant Zephyran tried to turn his head to look at the other humans, but Marcus pressed the neural disruptor more firmly against his skull. I wouldn't move if I were you, Marcus advised. My finger might slip. You cannot do this, Vorthak said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. We are official representatives of the hegemony security forces. Any action against us will be considered an act of war. Actually, said the human lieutenant who had entered with the squad, you're tourists. According to station records, your official tour of duty ended 3 hours ago. You're currently on shore leave, which means you have no more legal authority than any other civilian. And civilians who assault other civilians can be detained by station security or military personnel. Marcus couldn't help but smile. Meet Lieutenant Sarah Chun, my sister, and the finest tactical intelligence officer in the Human Defense Corps. Turns out she's been monitoring hegemony communications all morning. Sarah Chun stepped forward, her weapon trained on Grixtau, while her team moved to cover the other approaches to the commercial district. We've been tracking your little harassment campaign for the past week, she said matter-of-factly. 7 different incidents of abuse of authority, 3 cases of assault, and at least a dozen violations of station neutrality protocols. The only reason we haven't acted before now is that none of your previous victims were willing to file formal complaints. Probably because they were afraid of retaliation, Marcus added. But here's the thing about humans. We don't scare easy, and we really don't like bullies. Ziritich, who had been watching the confrontation with wide eyes, slowly climbed to her feet. Her cleaning supplies were scattered across the floor, and her simple work clothes were rumpled from kneeling, but there was something different about her posture now. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just amazement that someone had finally stood up to the enforcers who had made her life miserable. What happens now? She asked quietly. Marcus kept the neural disruptor steady against Zephyran's skull while he considered the question. Around the commercial district, other beings were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the realization that the immediate danger might be over. But the larger implications of what had just happened were only beginning to sink in. Now, Marcus said, these 3 are going to apologize for their behavior. Not because I'm forcing them to, but because they're going to realize that continuing this kind of conduct is going to make their lives very difficult. Apologize? Grixtal snarled, though his voice was slurred from the nerve damage. We do not apologize to inferior species. That's your choice, Sarachun said calmly. But let me explain what's going to happen if you don't. First, we'll file formal assault charges with the station authorities. Second, we'll submit a detailed report to the Galactic Council documenting your abuse of authority. Third, we'll make sure that every human military unit in this sector knows exactly what you 3 look like and what you've been doing. So what? Fortak demanded. Humans are a minor species. Your threats mean nothing. Marcus exchanged a glance with his sister, and she nodded slightly. It was time for the lesson that every bully eventually learned if they lived long enough. Let me tell you something about humans, Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a fundamental concept. We're not the biggest species in the galaxy. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally gifted. But we have 2 qualities that make us very dangerous enemies. He paused, letting the silence stretch out while the three enforcers waited to hear what came next. First, we remember everything. Every slight, every injustice, every act of cruelty. We keep records, and we share them, and we never forget. And second, we're everywhere. There are human colonies in 47 different star systems now, human ships in every trade route, human soldiers in every major military force. We're not just a species anymore, we're a network. What are you saying? Zephyrin asked, though there was a note of unease in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand. I'm saying that if you continue this behavior, word will spread, Saracen explained. Human traders will find reasons to avoid doing business with you. Human mechanics will discover problems with your ships that take longer to repair than usual. Human bartenders will serve you watered-down drinks. Human information brokers will somehow forget to mention opportunities that might interest you. And if you escalate to actual violence against human personnel, Marcus added, then you'll discover why we have the military reputation that we do. Because the thing about humans is we don't fight wars to win battles. We fight wars to win wars. And we don't stop until our enemies either surrender or can't fight anymore. The commercial district had grown completely quiet now, with dozens of alien beings listening to every word. This wasn't just a confrontation between a few individuals anymore. It had become a diplomatic incident with implications that stretched across the galaxy. This is madness, Vorthak said, but his voice lacked conviction. The hegemony will not stand for such threats. The hegemony will do whatever their cost-benefit analysis tells them to do, Sarah replied. And right now, the cost of protecting 3 officers who went rogue and assaulted civilians is going to look a lot higher than the cost of disciplining them. Marcus felt the tension in Zephyrin's body begin to change. The hegemony officer was starting to realize that his position was untenable, that continuing to resist would only make things worse. But he was also beginning to understand that backing down would be a public admission of weakness that could destroy his career. I'll give you a way out, Marcus said quietly, speaking directly into Zephyrin's ear. You can apologize to the lady, pay for the damage you've caused, and walk away with nothing worse than a formal reprimand. Or you can keep pushing and find out exactly how creative humans can be when someone threatens our friends. Friends? Zephyrin asked. You don't even know her. Marcus glanced at Zyrtich, who was still standing amid her scattered cleaning supplies, but no longer looked like a victim. There was strength in her posture now, and determination in her eyes. I know she's someone who was doing her job, and didn't deserve to be terrorized by 3 thugs with badges, he said. That's enough for me. The standoff in the commercial district had reached a tipping point. Around the edges of the confrontation, representatives from a dozen different species watched with fascination as a single human continued to hold 3 of the galaxy's most feared enforcers at bay. What had started as a simple act of bullying had escalated into something much larger, a test of wills that would determine whether might truly made right in the corridors of Celestial Peace Station. Lieutenant Zephyrin's breathing had become labored, whether from stress or from the proximity of the neural disruptor to his brainstem. The weapon's electrical field was designed to be safe at close range, but prolonged exposure could cause disorientation and neural feedback. Marcus was walking a fine line between maintaining control and actually injuring his captive. 30 seconds, Saracen announced, checking her chronometer. Station security will be here in 30 seconds, and when they arrive, we'll need to provide them with a full report of this incident. That report can describe how 3 off-duty enforcers voluntarily resolved a misunderstanding with a civilian worker, or it can describe how they resisted detention after committing assault. Captain Vorthak's damaged armor sparked again as he shifted his weight, trying to find a position that would give him a tactical advantage. But with 6 human soldiers covering every possible escape route, and his own systems compromised, his options were severely limited. The hegemony had trained him to win battles through overwhelming force, not to negotiate his way out of diplomatic disasters. This is extortion, he growled. No, Marcus replied calmly. This is consequences. You made a choice to abuse your authority. Now you get to make another choice about how this situation ends. Grixtal had finally managed to regain most of his motor control, though two of his four arms still twitched occasionally from residual nerve damage. The Korthax enforcer was calculating odds, weighing his chances of success in a direct assault against 6 armed humans. But something in their bearing, their casual professionalism, suggested that they had been in far worse situations and emerged victorious. "What guarantee do we have that you'll keep your word?" Zephyrin asked. "How do we know that apologizing won't simply be used as evidence of guilt?" "Because," Sarah Chun said, "humans understand the concept of honor. We keep our bargains, even with people we don't like. But more than that, we're practical. Getting you 3 to change your behavior serves our interests better than destroying you does." Around the commercial district, alien beings were beginning to whisper among themselves as they processed what they were witnessing. The Veltar, in particular, were watching Zero-TH with expressions of amazement. For most of their species' history since the Hegemony War, they had accepted abuse and discrimination as simply the price of survival. But now one of their own was standing straight and proud, while the galaxy's most powerful enforcers were being forced to account for their actions. "The lady is waiting," Marcus said, nodding towards Zero-TH. "And frankly, so am I. My arm is getting tired, and my patience is running out. Make your choice." Zephyrin was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through the political calculations that governed his career. The Hegemony rewarded strength and punished weakness, but they also valued officers who could adapt to changing circumstances. If word of this incident reached his superiors, how would they view his handling of the situation? "Lieutenant Zero-TH," he said finally, using her actual name for the first time instead of simply referring to her as worker or cleaner. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. My actions were inappropriate, and I will ensure that proper compensation is provided for any inconvenience caused." The words were stilted and formal, clearly rehearsed rather than heartfelt, but they were an official apology from a Hegemony officer to a member of a conquered species. In the political landscape of the galaxy, that represented a significant shift in power dynamics. "Thank you," Zero-TH replied quietly. She was still afraid. Anyone could see that, but she was no longer cowering. The simple act of being defended had given her something that had been missing from her life since the Hegemony War: dignity. Vorthak looked at his subordinate with disgust. "You weak fool. The Hegemony does not bow to inferior." "Captain," Sarah Chan interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat, "I strongly advise you to consider your next words very carefully. Your lieutenant has chosen to de-escalate this situation in a way that preserves everyone's honor. You can follow his example, or you can continue to dig yourself deeper into a hole that your superiors will not appreciate." Marcus could feel the tension in Zephyrin's body begin to relax slightly as the immediate threat of violence receded. But Vorthak was a different kind of opponent, someone whose entire identity was built around the concept of Hegemony supremacy. Backing down would be psychologically devastating for him, regardless of the practical consequences. "The Hegemony has conquered 17 star systems," Vorthak said, his voice rising with passion. "We have defeated every enemy we have ever faced. We do not apologize to cleaning ladies, and we do not take orders from primitive apes who barely understand the technology they've stolen." The silence that followed was profound. Even the background noise of the station's life support systems seemed to fade as every being in the commercial district waited to see what would happen next. Vorthak had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had chosen to escalate rather than retreat. Marcus sighed softly, as if he was disappointed, but not particularly surprised. "Grixtal," he said conversationally, "do you share your captain's opinions about humans and cleaning ladies?" The Korthax enforcer looked back and forth between Marcus and Vorthak, his 4 arms flexing as he tried to calculate the odds. He was a mercenary, not an ideologue, and his survival instincts were finally beginning to override his loyalty to his employers. I am paid to follow orders, not to share opinions, he said carefully. Smart answer, Sarachan approved. Captain Vorthak, you now have a choice to make. Your subordinates have both chosen to resolve this situation peacefully. You can join them, or you can face the consequences of your decisions alone. But Vorthak was beyond rational calculation now. The public humiliation of being forced to back down from a single human had triggered something primal in his psychology, some ancient warrior instinct that valued honor above survival. Enough, he roared, activating the emergency systems in his damaged armor. Sparks flew as overloaded circuits tried to deliver maximum power to his servo-assisted muscles. I am a Lord Commander of the Hegemony military. I will not be lectured by humans. He charged forward with the desperate fury of someone who had chosen death before dishonor. His massive fists, augmented by powered armor, could punch through steel plating. His species had evolved as apex predators on a world where only the strongest survived to reproduce. Everything about him was designed for violence and domination. Marcus released his hold on Zephyran and spun away from Vorthak's charge, the neural disruptor crackling with electrical energy as it swept through the air. But instead of trying to match the hegemony officer's strength, he used momentum and leverage, redirecting the massive alien charge into one of the support pillars that held up the commercial district ceiling. The impact was tremendous. Vorthak's damaged armor finally failed completely, systems overloading and shutting down as he crashed into the reinforced metal with enough force to dent the structural support. He slumped to the ground, unconscious but breathing, his body finally succumbing to the feedback from his compromised enhancement systems. Well, Marcus said, retracting his weapon and checking to make sure Vorthak was still alive, I guess that answers the question about whether he was willing to negotiate. Zephyran stared at his fallen commander with a mixture of shock and calculation. Vorthak had been his superior officer for 3 years, and had seemed invincible in every previous confrontation. But now he was lying unconscious at the feet of a human who looked like he had barely exerted himself. How? The hegemony lieutenant asked. He outweighed you by a factor of 3. His armor should have made him unstoppable. Should have, yes, Marcus agreed. But here's something else about humans that you might not have learned yet. We've been fighting things that are bigger and stronger than us for our entire evolutionary history. We didn't survive because we could outmuscle saber-toothed tigers or outrun direwolves. We survived because we could outsmart them. Station security chose that moment to arrive, a mixed squad of Centauri peacekeepers and automated enforcement drones. Their leader, a tall Centauri with the insignia of a chief inspector, looked around the commercial district and immediately began calculating the political ramifications of what he was seeing. Chief Inspector Dalrath, Sarachan said, stepping forward with the easy confidence of someone who had expected this arrival. We have a situation that requires your attention. 3 off-duty enforcers assaulted a civilian worker, and when human personnel intervened to protect her, one of them chose to escalate to violence. The inspector's 4 eyes focused on different aspects of the scene simultaneously. The unconscious Vorthak, the nervous Zephyran, the defiant Grixtal, and the humans who had somehow managed to subdue 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous enforcers without suffering so much as a scratch. I see, Dalrath said carefully. And I suppose you have evidence of these alleged assaults? Full sensor recordings from my squad's equipment, Sarah replied, handing over a datapad. Audio, video, and biometric data showing the entire incident from beginning to end. You'll find that human personnel acted entirely within the parameters of the Station Defense Accords. As the inspector reviewed the recordings, Marcus walked over to where Zira-TH was gathering her scattered cleaning supplies. She looked up at him with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and something that might have been hope. Are you all right? He asked. I think so, she replied. I'm still trying to understand what just happened. Why did you help me? You don't know me, and your people have nothing to gain from protecting a Veltar cleaning lady. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain something that was fundamental to human nature, but might seem alien to someone from a species that had learned to survive through submission. Where I come from, he said finally, we have a saying, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. You were being hurt by people who were supposed to protect you. I couldn't just walk away from that. But the risk, 0th said, they could have killed you. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. But they could have killed you too, eventually. The only difference is that I had the training and equipment to fight back. You didn't. That doesn't make your life less valuable than mine. It just means I had a responsibility to use my advantages to protect you. Around them, the commercial district was slowly returning to normal. The other aliens were going back to their business, though many of them kept glancing at the humans with expressions that mixed fear and respect. The 3 enforcers were being processed by station security, their futures now dependent on political calculations far above their pay grade. But for 0th, something fundamental had changed. She had learned that there were beings in the galaxy who would stand up for strangers, who would risk their own safety to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a lesson that would spread through the Veltar community and eventually through every subjugated species that heard the story of what had happened in the commercial district of Celestial Peace Station. 3 weeks after the incident in the commercial district, the ripple effects were still spreading through the political landscape of the galaxy. What had started as a simple case of bullying had become a diplomatic crisis that forced every major power to reconsider their assumptions about humans and their role in the galactic community. In the depths of the Hegemony High Command, Lord Marshal Kethvar reviewed the incident reports with the cold calculation that had made him one of the most feared military leaders in known space. The holographic displays showed every angle of the confrontation, every tactical decision, every moment where his officers had failed to maintain control of the situation. Explain to me, he said to the assembled staff officers, how 3 of our most experienced enforcers were neutralized by a single human soldier. The silence in the command chamber was profound. The Hegemony military had built its reputation on overwhelming superiority, on the assumption that their natural advantages in size, strength, and technology made them unstoppable. But the recordings from Celestial Peace Station suggested that those assumptions might be dangerously flawed. The human demonstrated superior tactical awareness, offered Colonel Thexrin, the Hegemony's chief intelligence officer. He anticipated their movements, used electronic warfare to create tactical advantages, and received support from other human personnel who had been monitoring the situation. In other words, Kethvar said, his voice dripping with contempt, our officers were outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought by what we have consistently described as a primitive species. Is that your assessment, Colonel? Sir, the humans have demonstrated capabilities that we may have underestimated. Underestimated? The Lord Marshal's voice cut through the air like a blade. Colonel, we have 17 star systems under our control. We have the largest military force in known space. And you're telling me that we underestimated a species that has been in space for less than 3 centuries. But even as he expressed his outrage, Kethvar was privately conducting his own analysis of what he had witnessed. The human soldier, Chun, according to the intelligence files, had displayed tactical thinking that would have been impressive in a Hegemony Special Forces operative. More importantly, he had shown the kind of calm under pressure that came only from extensive combat experience. On the other side of the galaxy, in the crystal spires of New Terra, Admiral Elena Rodriguez was having a very different conversation with the Human Defense Corps command staff. The mood in the briefing room was subdued, but satisfied, like poker players who had just won a significant hand without revealing how good their cards really were. The Hegemony is requesting a formal meeting to discuss mutual security concerns, reported General Harrison Blake, the Corps' senior intelligence officer. Translation: they want to know exactly what we're capable of, and they're hoping we'll tell them. What's our response? Admiral Rodriguez asked. The standard diplomatic reply, Blake said with a slight smile. We're always happy to discuss ways to improve galactic security, but we see no need for any dramatic changes to current policies. The truth, which none of them spoke aloud, was that the incident at Celestial Peace Station had accomplished something that years of formal diplomacy had failed to achieve. The galaxy's major powers were now taking humanity seriously as a potential threat rather than dismissing them as upstart primitives. It was a delicate balance, respect without fear, strength without aggression. But it was exactly the position that human strategists have been working toward since first contact with alien civilizations. "What about Dragon 7? Rodriguez asked, referring to Marcus Chun by his operational designation. "How is he handling the attention?" "He's requested permission to return to standard duties," Blake replied. "Apparently, he finds all the diplomatic analysis boring." His exact words were that he just wanted to get back to doing his job. Meanwhile, in the humble quarters assigned to service personnel on Celestial Peace Station, Zira TH was discovering that her life had been transformed in ways that she was still trying to understand. The other Veltar workers looked at her differently now, as if her proximity to the famous incident had somehow changed her fundamental nature. Some regarded her with awe, others with envy, and a few with suspicion. "You should have stayed down," muttered Vel Sith, one of the older cleaning staff who had worked on the station for nearly a decade. "Drawing attention to yourself, making the powerful angry. Nothing good comes from that kind of notice." But Zira TH had found that she could no longer simply accept such warnings. Something had changed in her during those terrifying minutes in the commercial district, something that made it impossible to return to her previous state of resigned invisibility. "The human was right," she said quietly. "We shouldn't have to accept abuse just because we're afraid of the consequences. We shouldn't have to live as if we're grateful for the privilege of being ignored." "Easy words," Vel Sith replied. "But the human has weapons and training and a military to back him up. What do we have?" It was a fair question, and one that Zira TH had been thinking about constantly since the incident. The Veltar were scattered across the galaxy, working as servants and laborers with no central government and no military force to protect them. They survived by being useful and invisible by never giving anyone a reason to notice them. But the human, Marcus, had shown her something different. He had demonstrated that strength could be used to protect rather than exploit, that power could be exercised on behalf of those who had none. It was a concept that went against everything she had been taught about how the galaxy worked. A soft chime from her door announced a visitor, which was unusual. Service personnel rarely received guests, especially during work hours. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find a human woman in a diplomatic uniform, someone she had never seen before, but who somehow looked familiar. "Zira TH? My name is Dr. Elizabeth Chun. I'm with the Human Colonial Administration's outreach program. I was hoping we could talk." The family resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same confident bearing that she had seen in the soldier who had defended her. But where Marcus had radiated controlled violence, this woman projected calm intelligence and genuine concern. "You're related to Marcus is my cousin," Dr. Chin confirmed. "He told me about what happened in the commercial district. May I come in?" Zira TH stepped aside to let her enter the small quarters that served as both living space and sleeping area for service personnel. Dr. Chun looked around with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely interested in understanding how other people lived. "I wanted to thank you," Dr. Chun said. "Thank me? I don't understand. I didn't do anything." "You stood up," Dr. Chun said simply. "When the choice was between submission and dignity, you chose dignity. That took courage." "I was terrified," Zira TH admitted. "I still am. Every day, I expect them to come back, or to find some way to punish me for causing trouble." "That's exactly what makes it courage," Dr. Chin explained. "Being afraid, but doing the right thing anyway. Marcus told me that you reminded him why humans fight in the first place. I still don't understand what that means." Dr. Chan was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Humans have a concept called the underdog. It refers to someone who is expected to lose, who faces overwhelming odds, but who fights anyway because the alternative is unacceptable. We admire underdogs because we see ourselves in them. But Humans are one of the most powerful species in the galaxy now. Now, yes, but we remember what it was like when we weren't. When we were just one small species on one small planet, looking up at the stars and wondering if we were alone. We remember what it felt like to be weak and afraid and hoping that somewhere out there, someone stronger would be willing to help. Dr. Chun reached into her diplomatic pouch and pulled out a data pad. I'm here to offer you something. The Human Colonial Administration has a program for refugees and displaced persons. We provide education, training, and opportunities for people who want to build new lives. It's not charity. We expect people to work and contribute, but it's a chance to be more than just invisible. Zero-TH stared at the data pad as if it might explode. The idea of leaving the station, of starting over somewhere else, was both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent so long learning to be invisible that the prospect of being seen, of matching, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Why, she asked. What do humans gain from helping Veltar refugees? Short term? Nothing, Dr. Chen admitted. Long term? We gain allies who understand the value of cooperation and mutual respect. We gain citizens who know the difference between strength and cruelty. We gain people who will remember that when they needed help, humans were willing to provide it. And if I refuse, then you return to your work, and we respect that choice. No pressure, no consequences. But the offer remains open if you change your mind. As Dr. Chen left, Zero-TH sat in her small quarters holding the data pad and thinking about the choices that lay before her. She could remain on the station, continue her invisible existence, and hope that the powerful would leave her alone. Or she could accept the human offer, risk everything on the possibility of building something better. It wasn't really a choice at all. 2 days later, as the transport ship Endeavour prepared to depart Celestial Peace Station for the human colony of New Geneva, Zero-TH stood at the observation deck looking back at the massive structure that had been her home for 3 years. Other Veltar refugees stood beside her, each carrying their few possessions and their hopes for a different kind of future. Nervous? Asked Dr. Chun, who was accompanying the refugees to their new home. Terrified, Zero-TH admitted, but also excited. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just surviving. As the ship entered hyperspace and the station disappeared into the blue-shifted glow of faster-than-light travel, Zero-TH thought about the human soldier who had changed her life with a simple act of defiance. She understood now why humans had become such a significant force in galactic politics. It wasn't their technology or their military strength, though both were impressive. It was their fundamental belief that everyone deserved dignity, that strength should be used to protect rather than exploit. Across the galaxy, the story of what had happened in the commercial district continued to spread. It was told in a dozen different languages, with details that varied depending on who was telling it and who was listening. But the central message remained the same. There were beings in the universe who would stand up for strangers, who would risk everything to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For some species, it was a warning about the dangerous unpredictability of humans. For others, it was a promise of hope in a galaxy that had seemed designed to crush the weak. And for humanity itself, it was a reminder of who they were and what they stood for. The age of human expansion into space had begun not with conquest or domination, but with a single soldier deciding that a frightened cleaning lady deserved better treatment than she was receiving. It was perhaps the most human way possible to announce their presence on the galactic stage. Some stories end with victory in battle or the overthrow of tyrants. But this story ended with something simpler and more profound. The recognition that in a universe full of cruelty and indifference, the choice to show compassion was itself a revolutionary act. And that humans, despite their flaws and limitations, had decided to be the species that made that choice again and again whenever they encountered someone who needed help. It was the beginning of what historians would later call the human moment, The period when a young species from a small blue world reminded the galaxy what it meant to fight for something greater than yourself. And it all started with a maid who was humiliated until a dragon soldier decided to take action.